Good evening, and thank you for joining us at Sacks-Herenstein Center's Haggadah Highlights. I'm Dr. Shira Weiss, and I'm joined by the center's director, Dr. Erica Brown, to discuss Rabbi Sacks's insights on Haggadah during this particularly challenging year. With sensitivity to the current situation in Israel, today is day 193 of the war, the tragic losses that our nation has endured, and the ongoing suffering, fear, and uncertainty in Israel, as well as the rise in anti-Semitism throughout the world, we wanted to highlight ideas to enrich the meaning of the Seder experience. Now, this year, two sections of the Haggadah have far more relevance and meaning for me than ever before. And the first one is early in Magid, as we retell Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. We read, or some sing. I'll just share my screen with you here. You can look on your source sheets that were sent to you in advance. And we read here, Vihi sha'amda lavotenu velanu, shelo achad balvad amar aleinu lachalotenu, ela shebechol dor v'dor omdim aleinu lachalotenu, v'hakadosh baruch hu matilenu miyadam. And the English translation reads, and it's this that has stood for our ancestors and for us, since it's not only one person or nation that has stood against us to destroy us, but rather in each generation they stand against us to destroy us. But the Holy One, blessed be He, rescues us from their hand. Now, many suggest that the Vehi, the this, that has stood for our ancestors and for us, refers to the promise God made to Abraham at the Brit Ben B'Tarim in Genesis to save his descendants, from the persecuting hands of their enemies mentioned in the previous paragraph of the Haggadah. And the promise, which stood by our patriarchs in their moments of suffering, gave them courage to endure their fate so they could see the actualization of this promise that eventually redeemed them. And the Midrash in Genesis Rabbah explains that the promise has stood firm for our forefathers and for us. So Vihi sha'amda lavotenu vilanu, meaning when God promised Abraham that he would exact retribution from the Egyptians and eventually free his offspring from bondage, the promise included not just salvation for his generation, but for future exiles as well. Now, one of the hardest realities for me personally to come to terms with since October 7th is that hatred, violence, and oppression of the Jews is no longer a distant memory in history, but it's become a contemporary reality. Now, I'm a student of medieval Jewish philosophy. I've learned about the Crusades, the Inquisition, how the Jews have been chased out of every place that they've called home. And my own grandfather witnessed countless atrocities in multiple concentration camps as an adolescent, and he was the only member of his family, of his immediate family, to survive the Holocaust. Yet somehow I felt that it was all in the past. It was history. There was a sense of detachment. There's now new meaning, a new contemporary relevance to the verse, Shebechol dor v'dor omdim aleinu lachalotenu. In each generation, they stand against us to destroy us. Now, Rabbi Sacks traced the progression of hatred for Jews throughout history. In the Middle Ages, when Jews were hated for religion, in the 19th and 20th centuries, when Jews were hated for their race, and today, for our nation state, for Israel, as anti-Semitism is commonly disguised as anti-Zionism. And I recently heard Dr. Tal Becker, who was legal advisor of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and part of Israel's delegation at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, several months ago, when South Africa accused Israel of genocide on the international stage. And the Sacks-Herenstein Center is privileged to host a Zoom event on May 8th with Dr. Becker, where I'll interview him and gain greater insight from his really unique vantage point. But Dr. Becker's perspective about his false sense of security on October 6th really struck me. And since reflecting post-October 7th upon that false sense of security, he described how Jewish history is kind of like a cyclical ebb and flow. And perhaps his view on October 6th was at a peak, only for a descent on October 7th. And that, I think, is what the Haggadah is referring to. It was not only one person or one nation who sought to destroy us. It wasn't just the Romans or the Babylonians or the Nazis, but rather Shebechol dor v'dor, in each generation. If you look on your source sheet, I'll share my screen again with you. Rabbi Sacks, in his book on religious violence, which he entitled Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence, he writes, too often in the history of religion, people have killed in the name of the God of life, waged war in the name of the God of peace, hated in the name of the God of love, and practiced cruelty in the name of God of compassion. Now, most conflicts in reality have nothing to do with religion, but rather revolve around power, territory, and glory. Yet if religion can be enlisted, Rabbi Sacks says it will be. To the contrary, he argues, and he emphasizes, no soul was ever saved by hate. No truth was ever proved by violence. No redemption was ever brought by holy war. No religion won the admiration of the world by its capacity to inflict suffering on its enemies. Dr. Daniel Gordis, Sacks Book Prize recipient this past year, spoke at YU at a book event in November, and he described how when Israelis needed to hide in their safe rooms on October 7th, it brought the Jews' experience in Europe to Israel. And he highlighted one crucial difference, though. He said Zionism's promise was to create a new Jew. After the pogroms in Europe, the Jewish victim bandaged themselves up, and they wondered where and when it was going to happen next. But by contrast, on October 7th, Jews in Israel reacted very differently. They united, they mobilized with a sense of responsibility to the hostages, to the anguished families, to the young widows, and to the orphans. And Gordis, in his book, Impossible Takes Longer, argues that the state of Israel transformed the existential condition of the Jewish people from perpetual victimhood to pride and self-reliance. And it's this pride and self-reliance which characterize the promise of Zionism that's reflected in the vision of the pioneers in their early kibbutz Haggadah. And if you look on the source sheet, he writes, the Haggadah says, they redefine Manishana. How is this night different from all other nights? The early kibbutzniks write, on all other nights our towns were besieged and we were surrounded by enemies inciting us. On this night we sit secure in our home and our towns are flourishing. How is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights we would celebrate our festival of freedom when we were controlled by a foreign ruler. Now we are free people in our free land, the state of Israel. Though the state of Israel transformed the existential condition of the Jew and his ability to defend itself, it didn't yet fully fulfill the vision of the early kibbutzniks. And again, Shavachol Dor Vador Omdim Aleinu Lachalotenu, we're seeing again in every generation. Now, the end of Yehisha Amda concludes with an affirmation of faith. V'hakadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu miyadam. But the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hand. Now, many conceptualize faith, emunah, as trust in God's protection, similar to how Rabbi Sacks refers to optimism, kind of a more passive virtue. But faith for Rabbi Sacks is active, not just relying on God's salvation against the horrors that we encounter, but actively responding to them. And to heal a fractured world, he writes the following. He, meaning God, does not want the people of the covenant to be one that accepts the evils and injustices of the world as the will of God. In Judaism, faith is not acceptance, but protest against the world that is, in the name of the world that is not yet, but ought to be. And Rabbi Sacks contrasts passive optimism to active hope. And he affirms the value of human protest against immorality. In fact, not accepting the status quo, but rather questioning and challenging the condition of the world in order to improve it is precisely the lesson to be taught on the Seder night. And Rabbi Sacks affirms, continuing in this reading, to be a Jewish child is to learn how to question. 4 times the Mosaic book refer to children asking questions, the 4 sons of the Haggadah. The most significant family ritual, the Seder service of Passover, begins with a question asked by a child against cultures that see unquestioning obedience as the ideal behavior of a child. Jewish tradition in the Haggadah regards the child who has not learned to ask as the lowest, not the highest, stage of development. Judaism is God's perennial question mark against the condition of the world. That things are as they are is a fact, not a value. Only one who asks whether the world should be as it is capable of changing what it is. I remain in awe, Rabbi Sacks writes, at the challenge God has set us to be different, iconoclasts of the politically correct, to be God's question mark against the conventional wisdom of the age, to build, to change, to mend the world until it becomes a place worthy of the divine presence. Rabbi Reuven Tarragon recounted Natan Sharansky's response when asked to describe the moment in his life when he most felt God's presence. And he shared that Jews see God's presence not in the life of the individual, but rather in the life of a nation. And he recounted in his lifetime how a mighty, evil empire intimidated the entire world, and everyone was afraid to challenge them. And nations sought tenuous treaties, an arrangement whereby the world would keep the peace, and no one would interfere in the domestic affairs of this evil empire. But there was one small group, he says, of Jews who arose, reasserted their Jewish identity, and reclaimed their membership in the Jewish nation. It was a small group, at first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, but small compared to the enormous size of the enemy, whom everyone else feared. When Jews across the world heard about them, they rallied for them. They pressured governments, and they then, blow after blow, rained on the Soviet Union until it collapsed from within and the Iron Curtain fell, and the Jews were liberated once again. That's the V'hi She'amda, and this is what has stood for us and for our fathers, because in every generation, they try to destroy us, and God saves us from their hands. And even though enemies from Hitler to Stalin to Sinwar may have succeeded at killing more individuals than we can bear, miraculously, Am Yisrael continues to exist. Now, the Jewish community in Israel and in the diaspora today, alongside allies throughout the world, has united in protest, in questioning moral relativism in the guise of the promotion of freedom. They've united in challenging misconceptions of genocide and in protesting against the horrific reality that currently is, to fight for the world that is not yet, but ought to be. And now long-term moral fortitude is needed to continue the protest on behalf of the murdered, on behalf of the hostages, and on behalf of the courageous defenders on the really challenging road that lies ahead as international pressures mount and support wanes. And throughout his work, Rabbi Sacks described Judaism as God's call to human responsibility, to not only the Jewish, but to the human story, to heal the wounds of an injured world with justice, compassion, and dignity. And Rabbi Sacks writes, just share one last quote with you. Sorry. He says, the day will come when the story of Israel in modern times will speak not just to Jews, but to all who believe in the power of the human spirit, as it reaches out to God as an everlasting symbol of the victory of life over death, hope over despair. Israel has achieved great things. It has taken a barren land and made it bloom again. It's taken an ancient language, the Hebrew of the Bible, and made it speak again. It's taken the West's oldest faith and made it young again. Israel has taken a tattered, shattered nation and made it live again. Israel is the country whose national anthem, Hatikva, means hope. Israel is the home of hope. May the day when the good triumphs over evil come soon, and may we continue to hope in the promise of salvation from our enemies. Erica, over to you now.
Amen, Shira. Thank you so much. I think we've all been aware that although Nisan is a Hebrew month of joy and blessings, the blessings of spring, the blessing of newness, the blessing that we make one time a year over the flowering fruit trees, there's a sense that this year is different. that when we ask, why is this night different than all other nights, we have an answer, and the answer is not a happy answer. We think, just to take a moment for everyone to think about where you were last year, who was at the Seder table last year, if you can remember what the news was last year, and then think about where we are this year, not only since October 7th, but since last Saturday night. I don't know about you, but as we rushed to hear the news on Saturday night and just watched just the sky illuminated by ballistic missiles, there was the sense of, how will we sit at the Seder table at all? Because many soldiers won't. People are being called back in, and as Israel maintains its security, and as the world comes together, we just entered this Nisan in a state of great vulnerability and insecurity. I have right next to me this book by the philosopher Todd May, A Fragile Life, Accepting Our Vulnerability. And it was no accident, perhaps, that I picked it up this year to think a lot about the vulnerability and fragility that is different than the Seder table. I imagine that many of us will put up hostage posters, perhaps leave an empty seat at the Seder, give everyone a small bio of a hostage to read and share. And yet at the same time, we don't want to tamper our joy. We're happy to be surrounded by others. And I went into this month with that tension. The Sacks-Herenstein Center has created, Shira shared in the link, an insert for your Haggadah. And I just want to read a quote from it because it's so profound, as we're looking for remarks by hostages, hostage families, rescued hostage and hostage families. I think of what Rachel Goldberg-Polin said at the United Nations on December 14th of 2023. And think about this as you have salt water at your table. I've cried a million tears. We all have. All those tears, our sea of tears, they all taste the same. Can we take them, gather them up, remove the salt, and pour them over our desert of despair and plant one tiny seed, a seed wrapped in fear, trauma, pain, war, and hope, and see what grows? One tiny seed. And that image of the seed and the salt water, these conflicting, contrasting, contradictory images, which are so powerful, we hold them together. Not only do we hold them together, but our matzah of affliction is also our bread of freedom. And so we're always dancing. We have korech, where we're dancing amidst these two feelings. But for the moment, I want to actually continue the theme that Shira presented. Like Shira, my family was in the Shoah. My grandparents were each redeemed, I'll use the term redeemed intentionally, were freed from Auschwitz one day apart from each other, one by the British and one by the Americans. It took them a year to be reunited. My grandfather, on his way to Israel, was in Italy, went back to find my mother in an orphanage in Lublin. And within a year, our family was reunited. A miracle, an absolute stunning miracle. But the Pesach of my youth was really a much darker time, because my grandparents felt the weight of their own personal history. And my grandmother would regularly say, why are we reading this story about Jews being freed from slavery? Our story was a much more important story. Now, I'm not here to judge who suffers the most, but what always is touching about the Seder is the way in which our personal stories, our national stories, are mirrored in this book. And there are people who use the same Haggadah each year, and they write in the margins who, before Pesach, who will be at their Seder, perhaps what food they'll be serving, perhaps events that happened in that year that has changed the family dynamic. And we're at that sort of, and we're at that point, that moment. So I'm going to share my screen and travel with you to a text I've thought a great deal about. And for those of you who have insights that you'd like to share, please feel free to. I think the Hebrew is a little bit a little problematic here, but V'yasimu alav sarei misim l'man anotam b'sivlotam Viven arei miskanot leparo et pitom vet Ramses. They set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pitom, and Ramses. This idea of placing taskmasters over people, and I want to sort of get into the mindset of where they were and where our hostages are now. This idea of oppressing people by setting taskmasters over them, anoto, to afflict them, bisivlotam, in their labor. Now, it could be afflict them with labor, or actually afflict them in the way in which they engage in their labor. And this becomes a discussion among the rabbis, an interesting and a complex discussion about what it would mean to afflict someone with labor. My Bubi, Aleh Shalom, shared with me that one of the things the Nazis made her do is to take dirt, they would move from one side of a field to the other side of a field, and then to take it back again to the same place. In other words, the Sisyphusian task of not accomplishing anything that had the aspect of a psychological warfare, a breakdown of a sense of meaning that generally we need in order to do work. We need to feel that there are results or outcomes. There's some sense of productivity, but to spend all of one's days, and this actually helped me understand this verse from Exodus 1 of what it means to afflict someone in the actual labor in which you engage them. But here's the thing about our people. Yanu, when they oppressed them, I'm gonna just read from my actually, Shira, do you want to? I think yours was a cleaner document.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm going to stop my share. Okay. Thank you. So we'll just go up a little bit, Shira. Thank you. V'chasher yanu oto ken yirbe v'chen yifot v'yakutsu mipnei b'nei Yisrael. Here's the thing about people who are oppressed unfairly, but have a very strong sense of mission and purpose. The more you try to oppress them, the deeper they understand what their purpose is. And I have to comment that one of the there have been, by various accounts, somewhere next to 30,000 babies who've been born in Israel since October 7th, many of them named after hostages, many of them named after various locations, kibbutzim, and towns in the Otef in the south. The idea that you know, when you oppress someone, they might give up, but when you oppress someone for whom living itself is meaningful, the actual act of life, the chai that we wear around our necks is meaningful, there's no way that you can get rid of them through oppression. They just increase. Now you can imagine for Pharaoh, who's trying to, what he called, deal wisely by strategically eliminating and reducing the number of Israelites, his strategy wasn't wise at all. He absolutely failed. And so what the Egyptians do is they work them more ruthlessly. What here, the term is bifarech. With some kind of, it's defined here as ruthless, hard, in a difficult way, in a way that makes no sense. And in fact, the Haggadah has its own definition of bifarech. Anyone remember what it is? The men do the women's work, the women do the men's work. Now, I don't know in the ancient day what was men's work and what was women's work. Frankly, I don't really know what it is today. But it's sort of an interesting take on what it means to have difficult work, is work that perhaps does not reflect your competencies or your socialization. Shira, would you mind going down more, please? I wanted to look down a little bit more to the Rabbi Sacks quote and his explanation in his Haggadah. The sages defined heavy labor as work that has no time limit, such as ordering someone to dig until I return. There are two aspects of slavery, physical and psychological, and Jewish law recognized that the psychological effects can sometimes be worse than the physical exhaustion of back-breaking labor. Heavy work, beferach, is work designed to crush the spirit of slaves by depriving them of the freedom to make decisions and subjecting them to someone else's will. Now, we've seen a great deal of this during the war, unfortunately, where Hamas has made certain claims of either a hostage has already died, or made claims about when a hostage might be returned. The hostage negotiations have been very complex and filled with this sort of psychological warfare. And you can imagine, I think it's made these words of the Haggadah jump out to me, of understanding what it means to be subject to this kind of cruelty and feel powerless to do anything. I don't know about you, but one of the feelings that I've struggled with over this period of many, many months, over 6 months now, is what can we do? And we've been praying, we've been reciting Tehillim, we've been sending money, we've been supporting our Israeli friends and family, neighbors, calling, and yet, at least for me, it feels like nothing. It feels like nothing until we can bring them home. I just actually texted Rachel Goldberg-Poland today, and she's expecting Hirsch at the Seder table. But more than expecting him at the Seder table, she's expecting all of us to help her bring him home in whatever way we can right now. Certainly, I imagine all of you have seen that the Bring Them Home movement now uses an hourglass to suggest there's a limited amount of time. And that too becomes part of the psychological warfare that we're fighting, and we would describe it as being oppressed. I certainly feel that oppression, and I feel it in a different way than perhaps, certainly than when I opened this Haggadah last year. Shira, would you mind going back to the screen share, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Let's go back up, because I want to talk a little bit about the crying. If we go back up to the actual text of Shemot, of Exodus, right here, thank you. So in the first chapter, there's this affliction, but the affliction isn't working. And there's affliction not only in the task, but in the psychological war, besivlotam, in the way in which the work was cast upon them. But at the end of chapter 2, Vayhi b'yamim harabim hahem, after these long, long days, Vayamat melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt dies. Now, when the king of Egypt dies, and this has happened before, when the king of Egypt dies, there's always a sense that maybe this presages something new. Maybe some dimension of political life has changed, which will change the forecast of the future. And I want to pay careful attention to that, because sometimes when we think we're in a position where nothing changes, something in the external world changes. We're befriended by no one, but then the enemy of the world, Iran, does something impulsive that they said they were going to do. And now suddenly we have our allies. That's something perhaps we couldn't have expected. And so political climates change things. But in this sense, V'yanchu v'nei Yisrael min ha'avodah, the Israelites cry out, Yizaku v'tal Shabbatam el Elohim min ha'avodah. And last year I said, and I very often say, because it's one of the most beautiful teachings of Rav Soloveitchik, is that the Israelites did not cry out in chapter 1. They did not cry out in chapter 1. They cried out at the end of chapter 2, even though they were afflicted in chapter 1. And even though the affliction intensified in its difficulty, they didn't cry out until Moses, according to Rav Soloveitchik, appears on the scene. Because until you have a savior, there's no point in crying. But I want to make a different distinction. Much as I love the Rav's explanation and hold on to it and treasure it, there's something else about this verse. Vayamat melech Mitzrayim. When political forces change, then there's this moment when you think maybe redemption is on the horizon now that we have new leadership. And therefore, we cry out in ways that we couldn't before because we didn't expect that anyone was going to pay attention to us. But now, with a regime change, something might change. Yizaku v'tal Shabbatam Elohim min ha'avodah. Somehow, all of their crying reached up to God, and v'yishma Elohim et naktam, and God heard them. Not only did God hear them, Vayar Elohim et bnei Yisrael v'yadai Elohim. God looked upon the Israelites and God took notice of them. The Rabbi Avadia Sforno, 16th century Italian commentator, explains, Za'aku me'ke'ev lev al avodatam. They cry out. He uses a verse from Isaiah about howling. They cry out about their fate and their enslavement. And he says, Vatal. God responded not because they were repenting or because they were crying. Lo bishvil tshuvatam utfilatam aval mekane al achzariyut. He was angry. He was zealously angry about the cruelty. And I think that's something also it just struck me about the Sforno is perhaps like Shira, I didn't expect that in this day and age, we'd see the kind of cruelty we saw in the Holocaust. That there's some kind of anger, a righteous indignation over being treated in a particular way when there's excessive cruelty that cannot be explained, and not only cannot be explained, but when others justify that oppression, when others actually praise that cruelty. Rabbi Sacks, as we talked about the psychological difficulties of their heavy labor. I'm sure if you could go down a drop, I wanted to actually relate this zaka, this crying, to the crying of the hostage voices. And this is from Yocheved Lifshitz, who's 85 and spent 17 days in captivity. They stormed into our homes. They beat people. They kidnapped others, the old and the young, without distinction. That could have leaped off the pages of our Haggadah, of our book of Exodus. This idea of storming into our homes, beating people, and we don't know the full effect of this trauma. It may take decades to process and to get people to tell their story, if they will tell it at all. Amit Susana was at 40, spent 55 days in captivity. I was chained for 3 weeks in Gaza. I was kept in a really dark room without being able to move. The feeling like they're taking me, like I'm some kind of object. I couldn't stand it. My instinct was just to fight, to do what I can. And Rachel Goldberg-Poland describes that psychological terror. From the very first day, it's been a slow motion terror. You know, sometimes you get a fright when you come around the corner and you didn't know someone was there. And you have that moment where you jump back and you're like, oh my gosh, and your heart is pumping in your chest. I didn't know it was sustainable, but it's been endless. On day 69, this is what her description was on day 69. And now we're at 193. She described what she was going through. Someone tore my heart out and took it away. I'm walking through this life in this very artificial way, just trying to do the best that I can so that I can function enough to be able to be productive in trying to save my son's life. So if any of us thought that maybe we just have that joyous Seder that we'd have every year, our job is to hear these cries, these real cries of oppression, and to howl about them until God hears them, until the political climate changes, until every hostage goes free. There's a beautiful tefillah that the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi David Lau, created, a prayer for the return of the hostages, which we've included on this source sheet. Shira, over to you.
Thank you. The second passage in the Haggadah that has new meaning for me this year is Shafol Chamatcha. And not only do we need to protest, as Erica was just saying, against the evil, the immorality of our enemies, but we ask God to subject them to the forces of justice. And we recite the paragraph of Shafol Chamatcha as we open the door for Eliyahu at the end of the Seder. I'll just share my screen here. You can see שפוך חמתך לגויים אשר לא ידעוך, ועל ממלכות אשר בשמך לא קראו, כי אכל את יעקב ואת נביאו השמו. שפך עליהם זעמך בחרון אפך ישיגם, תרדוף באף בתשמידם מתחת שמי השם. Pour your wrath upon the nations that did not know you, and upon the kingdoms that did not call upon your name, since they've consumed Jacob and laid waste his habitation. Pour out your fury upon them, and the fierceness of your anger shall reach them. You shall pursue them with the anger and eradicate from under the skies of the Lord. Now, some have conceived this passage as the most controversial in the Haggadah, questioning the appropriateness of such a call for vengeance when Judaism is a religion of love and compassion. But there can't be a successful move to the future without a real reckoning with the past. And the Radak, in interpreting these verses from Tehillim and from Eicha, he specifies is that the reason that nations deserve God's wrath is because they dismantled Jewish sovereignty when they destroyed Jerusalem and exiled the tribes of Judah, enemies that laid waste to his habitation, which Abarbanel interprets as the destruction of both Batei Mikdash, the holy temples. So the call is directed specifically at those nations that chose to self-identify as enemies of God and to commit unprovoked acts of brutality against us. Now, Rabbi Sacks explains that these biblical verses were added to the Haggadah during the Middle Ages, at one of the darkest periods of anti-Jewish persecution. And it began with the First Crusade in 1096 and the massacre of Jewish communities in Worms and Speyer and in Mainz, communities that we reflect about in the Kinot on Tisha B'Av. And that the destruction of these communities led to the centuries of persecution culminating in the Holocaust. And Rabbi Sacks, in his commentary on Shafo Chamatcha, in the Haggadah, in his Haggadah, writes, "For centuries, Jews suffered a series of devastating blows: massacres, pogroms, forced conversions, inquisitions, confinement to ghettos, punitive taxation, and expulsions, culminating in the very heart of enlightened Europe in the Holocaust. Yet these verses from Tehillim and from Eicha are almost the only trace left by this experience on the Haggadah, the night when we recall our past. Judaism," he says, "is a religion of justice. It's also a religion of love, compassion, forgiveness, generosity, and peace. But from the beginning, it has wrestled with the question of how to bring the divine presence down to earth in the structures and institutions of society. The necessary precondition is justice. Once that exists, there's room for the many other virtues that humanize our world. But without justice, something fundamental is missing. So Shafo Chamatcha, pour out your wrath. This passage is not a call for vengeance, but rather, according to Rabbi Sacks, it's not even a call for human action, but a call or a prayer for divine justice." Now, at this point of the Seder, as we turn from the past, from the recollecting of the Exodus to the future, we reflect on the tragedy of the Jewish people in the past, the many thousands and millions of people who were murdered, sometimes in the name of the God of love. And we ask God to reveal to us at the end of days the meaning of all of his suffering. And Rabbi Sacks suggests that these verses from Shafo Chamatcha are a cry of pain coming to us from one of the dark nights of the Jewish soul, as if to say, let us understand. Maybe one day, if not now, let us understand the justice of the world. If you're the true judge of all the earth, help us understand the suffering. Now, the Exodus from Egypt was both an act of rage and an act of mercy. The 10 plagues were meant to punish the Egyptians for their oppression, for the perach that Erica was speaking about, but they were also a demonstration of God's power to an enslaved people who fear that they may not be redeemed. And God heard the cries of the slaves and he saw their suffering, and out of an act of love and promise, he redeemed the downtrodden. So the angry God who pours out his wrath is the God who's pursuing justice for his people. And just as the redemption from Egypt was accompanied by God's venting his wrath on the Egyptians, so too in Shafo Chamatcha, we pray that God punish our current oppressors and pour his indignation on them. And it's fitting that the cup of Elijah is raised when reciting this passage, since Elijah was the zealous defender of God's will in the face of unremitting evil. And the Midrash associates Elijah with another biblical character, with Pinchas, who's the prototype of zeal and passion, which must characterize the battle for the final redemption, which is symbolized by the 5th cup in the Seder. And Rabbi Sacks describes the symbolism behind the ritual of this 5th cup. And in his Covenant and Conversation, he describes this as the cup of hope He says the drama of the fifth cup, the cup of Elijah, now becomes apparent. Pesach represents the start of the great journey of Jewish history, from slavery to freedom, Egypt to the promised land. What then became of it after the destruction of the Second Temple, the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Hadrianic persecutions, and the long, tragic series of events that led to the greatest exile of Jewish history? Could Jews celebrate freedom under such circumstances? The very festival that spoke of liberty gained became, for almost 2,000 years, a poignant reminder of what the Jewish people had lost: freedom, a land, a home. A new phrase was born: next year. This year we're slaves, next year we'll be free. This year we're here, next year in Israel. The past became the future. Memory was transfigured into hope. It's not too much to call the Jewish people the people of hope. What had happened once would happen again. As the prophets of exile said, there would be a second Exodus. The loss was only temporary. The divine promise was forever. And it was in this context that the debate over the fifth cup arose. Jews could speak about the 4 preliminary stages of redemption in Exodus, V'hotzeti, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti. But could they celebrate the fifth? Could they celebrate V'heveti, and I will bring you to the land? Not just that I will take you out from the oppression in Egypt, but that I will bring you to the land, the freedom from versus the freedom to that I talked about last year. That's the debate between Rashi, Rambam, and Ravid. Rashi says one should not drink a fifth cup. Rambam says one may. Ravid says one should. Hence the extra cup at the Seder table. Out of respect for the Rambam and Ravid, we pour it. Out of respect for Rashi, we don't drink it. According to the sages, unresolved halachic disputes will one day be resolved by Elijah. Hence, the fifth cup became known as the cup of Elijah. Now, regarding this fifth Lashon Geula, V'heveti, and I will bring you to the land. We're now in the land, but unfortunately, there's still more work to be done. And Rabbi Sacks talks about just this, even though he wasn't witnessing the current events of today. He talks about this idea in his essay in his Haggadah called The Missing Fifth. And he says in the half century since the Holocaust, the Jewish people has emerged from darkness to light. The state of Israel has come into being. The Hebrew language has been reborn. Jews have been brought to safety from the countries where they faced persecution. In the liberal democracies of the West, Jews have gained freedom and even prominence and affluence. But Israel is not yet at peace. In the diaspora, assimilation continues apace. Many Jews are estranged from their people and their faith. Something is missing from our celebration: the fifth cup. That is a measure of what still needs to be achieved. We have not yet reached our destination. The missing fifths remind us of work still to be done, a journey not yet complete. This Pesach Seder, the work that still needs to be done is clearer and more urgent than ever. And what's missing is more tragic and terrifying than most of us have experienced in our lifetimes. And this dichotomy, as Erica was talking about, that tension of celebrating the redemption from Egyptian suffering at a time of national crisis, of fear, of pain, is so, so challenging. And I read an article in The Atlantic about mixed emotions, which described the intense discomfort that results from mixed feelings and how they leave you confused about the right thing to do. And the psychologist quoted in the article argued that rather than trying to think more dichotomously, we should lean into the zone of mixed emotions, which is called dialectical thinking. And at each stage of this war, I've experienced these mixed emotions. At the hostage release months ago, I felt a combination of joy and relief on the one hand, and frustration and trepidation on the other. And watching the multiple layers of Israel's and its allies' defense systems intercepting Iran's multitudes of missiles and drones under the Shmei Hashem, the heavens of God, this past Motzei Shabbat, I felt overwhelming gratitude and awe on the one hand, and rage and fear about what's to come on the other. And as we say in Shafo Chamatcha, Tirdof ba'af v'tashmidei mitachat Shmei Hashem, as we quote from Lamentations from Echa, we shall pursue them with anger and eradicate them from under the skies of the Lord. And when I think about our obligation at our Seder every year to experience the celebration of the Exodus and our nation's redemption, how are we really supposed to feel that this year? It's easy to go through the physical motions, right? We'll lean on chairs to represent our freedom. We'll drink the wine. We'll recite the Hallel. But what about internally? What about these mixed emotions? One of my favorite essays, one of my favorite articles by Rabbi Soloveitchik is called Catharsis. And I think the reason why I was especially taken with this article is because of the very vulnerable way in which he writes. And he begins the essay by redefining gvura, strength. And he doesn't define it in the classic kind of Greek tragic hero way of somebody who advances boldly and arrogantly, but he says a true Gibbor is one who can retreat, who can withdraw. And he goes on to demonstrate how halacha demands at times that we retreat. In the physical realm, halacha demands sometimes that we don't eat certain foods, regardless of how good it smells or how good it looks, because it's not kosher and we have to restrain ourselves. And sometimes in the financial realm, we have to restrain ourselves from entering into some deal where we have the prospect of making a great profit if it's not really above board. But he says not only in the physical realm do we have to engage in catharsis, but we have to engage in catharsis emotionally as well. But how can we really retreat emotionally? Are we really completely in control of our emotions? Rabbi Soloveitchik writes there, in the emotional sphere, the cathartic act consists in retreating or disengaging from oneself, from one's own inner world, and renouncing something that's a part of oneself, such as a sentiment, a mood, or a state of mind. But he questions, can we indeed withdraw from ourselves, rejecting the feeling which grips us with enormous force, dismissing an experience which at times is overpowering? And then he illustrates this with an example. He describes the law, the halacha, that a festival, a chag, suspends the avelut, the mourning, for one of the 7 close relatives that we sit shiva for. And he says if one began to sit shiva a short time before the chag, before the holiday, and then the holiday comes, the holiday cancels the rest of the shiva. And he explains that avelut, mourning in halacha, it consists of more than just external rituals of sitting on a low chair or tearing one's clothes. It's an inner experience of despair, of complete existential failure that overwhelms a person. And he says, similarly, the commandment of Simchat Yom Tov, to rejoice on a holiday, it includes more than just the ceremonial, drinking wine and eating meat, but is a genuine experience of joy, of serenity, of peace of mind, deriving from our faith and our awareness of being in God's presence. And so he asks, how can a mourner who has just buried a beloved family member return from the graveyard where he's left a part of himself to an empty, dreary house in which everything reminds him of the beloved person he's lost? And how can he be expected to be joyous? And Rabbi Soloveitchik says, yet the halacha addresses itself to the lonely mourner, whispering to him, rise from your mourning, cast the ashes from your head, change your clothes, light the festive candles, recite over a cup of wine the Kiddush, extolling the Lord for giving us the festivals, pronounce the blessings of Shehecheyanu, join the jubilating community and celebrate the holiday as if nothing has transpired. And the halacha suggests to the person who's broken in body and spirit that he changes his mood, that he casts off his grief and choose joy. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik says very, very candidly, he asks, is such a metamorphosis of the state of mind of an individual really possible? Can one make the leap from utter bleak desolation and hopelessness into joyous trust? Can one replace the experience of the monstrosity with the feeling of highest meaningfulness? And he says very, very humbly, I have no right to judge. However, I know of people who attempted to perform this greatest of all miracles. This leap is certainly heroic, as he describes the truest expression of gvura. Now, on this Seder night, we likely will not be able to forget or put aside the grief, the pain, the fear that we're experiencing as a nation, nor should we. But let us also lean into our mixed emotions and rejoice as we relive the redemption of the past to bolster our faith in the redemption of the future. Erica.
Thank you so much, Shira. I referenced Todd May's book, A Fragile Life, and he talks about what gives life meaning is narrative coherence. And when the narrative is broken or disrupted, that narrative coherence is broken. He says we must embrace the fragility that lends our lives beauty and at the same time withdraws that beauty from us. There's no straight path nor a crooked one that will lead us beyond all this. Our home lies here, we might say. What I wanted to look at every year, I try to look at a different part of the Haggadah that I have not looked at closely before. There's so many of those parts. And as I was reviewing Rabbi Sacks's Haggadah, I thought about a part of Birkat Hamazon. Generally, this is the sort of part that we don't explain because we're used to saying it. We say it after we eat bread, after we eat a meal. So it's not the distinctive part of the Seder. And yet there's a line that really spoke to me, an explanation that he offered that I think is important here, because one of the casualties of all war is the question of belief. We're not going to enter a deep philosophical issue of the theodicy and this evening, nor will we resolve it. It's just a feeling that many people have right now that they've shared with me. For some, it's intensified their faith. For others, it's more of a struggle. So I'm going to look with you at a comment that Rabbi Sacks makes. Hold on. Let's try this again. Rabbi Sacks makes in his explanation of Birkat Hamazon. Nar ha'iti v'gam zakanti. We know this expression. Once I was young, now I'm old. Yet I've never watched a righteous man forsaken or his children begging for bread. So one must wonder: is it possible? Is it at all possible that the psalmist would never have seen a righteous person, someone who does good, be forsaken by God, or that someone who does good, or an innocent child begging for bread? Surely, Rabbi Sacks asks, throughout history, there were times when the righteous were forsaken. Indeed, this is one of those questions that, according to the Talmud, Moses asked God, why do the righteous suffer? I once heard, Rabbi Sacks says, a beautiful explanation from Rabbi Moses Feuerstein of Boston. The key phrase of the verse is lo ra'iti, standardly translated as I have not seen. The verb ra'iti, though, occurs twice in the book of Esther with a quite different meaning. How can I bear to watch the disaster that will befall my people? And how can I bear to watch the destruction of my family? The verb here does not mean see. It means stand by and watch, be a passive witness, a disengaged spectator. Ra'iti in this sense means seeing and doing nothing to help. That for Esther, as for the psalmist, is a moral impossibility. And somehow this reframing was very powerful for me. It's not that you've never seen a righteous person forsaken or an innocent child begging for help. It's that we cannot see and not do. And this sense of righteous motivation to change the injustices in the world that Shira spoke of is something that Rabbi Shai Held mentions in his brand new book, Judaism is About Love. In our own time, many of us are more confident of God's solidarity than we are of God's salvation. In other words, we believe that God is with us, even if we don't think that God will dramatically intervene to save us. That may indeed represent a vast gap or even a chasm between us and our biblical forebears. And yet they've bequeathed us something precious and potentially transformational: the insistence that we need not lie about our suffering, the awareness that honesty is never a sacrilege, the courage to cry out, and the confidence that injustice is to be resisted rather than accepted. And that takes me back to the first comments I made about the howling and the crying then and today. There is something very courageous about not lying about our suffering, being able to articulate our suffering and not withhold it as a result of faith, but feel that our faith motivates us to cry out. With the current time limitations that we have, I want to mention this beautiful and famous midrash in Breshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, where there's a word play between one pasuk from Breshit and a verse from Tehillim, verse from Psalms. Rabbi Yitzchak says, This is analogous to one who was passing from place to place and saw a building with a flame burning in it. And he said, is it possible? Shabira hazu below manhig? Is it possible that this building has no one watching over it? Hetzitz alav bal habira. The person who owned the building stared at him and said, Anihu bal habira. I do own this place. Kach lefi shaya avinu Avraham omer tomar shaolam hazeh below manhig. Hetzitz alav HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'amar lo. Anihu bal haolam. Sometimes we're in a time, a space, a trauma where we wonder, is there anyone ruling this world? Is there anyone who's in charge here? And it's at those times that we need the righteous voice of people who see the suffering and say, there needs to be someone who does something about this. And Heitzitz, the cry out, and then the Baal Habayit is forced to stare at us and stare us back in the eye and say, there is a ruler of the universe. I am that one. And together we will partner to change this place. Rabbi Held looks at this and says, Avram refuses to look away. Confronted with the abyss of meaninglessness, he will not avert his eyes. But not only does Avram refuse to turn away, he cares. Is it possible that this world has no one who looks after it? That possibility shakes Avram to the core of his being. The founding father of the Jewish people is someone who will not hide from the reality of human suffering. Ra'iti, we see it. We name it. And because we name it, we don't sit passively. We do something about it. And I'll close with this thought from Rabbi Sacks about the God who acts in history. In the darkest night, Israel was about to have its greatest encounter with God. Hope was to be born at the very edge of the abyss of despair. There was nothing natural about this, nothing inevitable. No logic can give rise to hope. No law of history charts a path from slavery to redemption. The entire sequence of events was a prelude to the single most formative moment in the history of Israel, the intervention of God in history, the supreme power intervening on behalf of the supremely powerless, not as in every other culture to endorse the status quo, but to overturn it. We are hoping this year that whatever has happened in Israel since October 7th will be overturned. We are hoping to see God's intervention in history. We saw it on Saturday night in a most miraculous way. May we see it again. May we bring every hostage home. May all of those hostages return with soldiers to the Seder table and enjoy a redemptive Passover. Wishing all of you the same. Thank you so much for joining us. Chag kasher v'sameach.